Hello, everyone. My name is Gil Panalosa, and this is the bi-weekly webinar Cities for Everyone, where every other week I invite fascinating people to share their stories so that it will help us become even more passionate advocates on creating equitable, sustainable, playful cities where everyone will be able to live healthier and happier. This is not a time for people to be spectators. Originally, I'm from Bogota, Colombia, and 18 years ago in Canada, I created 880 cities, a simple but powerful concept. What if everything we did in our cities had to be great for an 8 and for an 80? Not 8 to 88 and 80 as an indicator. Then it's going to be good for everybody. We need to stop building the cities as if everybody was 30-year-old and athletic. Our topic today, ending global sprawl. Ending global sprawl. And no one better to talk about this than Peter Calthorpe. Peter has worked across the US, in Canada, and Australia, in Europe, lots in China. And he's been studying this issue of sprawl and density and how to make it right. Because at the end of the day, it's land use and mobility are two sides of the same coin. He's been called the father of the transit-oriented development, but now he's going a step further and focusing on the grand boulevards that any city could substantially improve with better land use and better housing and better quality of life for all. Peter, thank you very much for accepting the invitation.
Happy to be here. It's
Thank you. So,
great to talk to an international group.
yeah, Peter is based now he lives in Berkeley, and he has done work all over the world. And we are very eager because this is a very critical moment in time when it might be the last time where millions and millions of homes are going to be built in places like the US and Canada. So, where are they going to be built? Because that's where millions and millions of people are going to live for the next centuries.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm a person who's been at this for a bit now, as you can tell by my gray beard. But I wanted to highlight one beginning for me. I was in partnership with a man named Sim Vanderen, who is really the father of sustainable communities. In fact, he and I wrote a book together in the 80s called Sustainable Communities, which was the first kind of fledgling steps into the notion that the way we shape the built environment can benefit the natural environment as well as the human condition. Um, Sim passed away a week ago, so I wanted to offer that information and condolences. He had been living in Point Reyes, just north of San Francisco, a wonderful man and a true pioneer to, I think, all the way we think now as we overcome the scourge of modernist design theory and planning practice. Um, this is just a little collage of some of the work I've done over many, many years. The Next American Metropolis was my first book after working with Sim, and it was maybe the point at which the idea of transit-oriented development was framed. After that, I did a book called The Regional City because I was really concerned with how metropolitan areas shape our lives, shape our economies, shape the human condition, of course, impact the environment. And it's really at the regional scale that the environment is most impacted. And so I wanted to think through a whole series of mechanisms to begin to shape that. We tend to plan at very small increments, and sometimes we're not cognizant of the collective impacts of those small steps. Most recently, I wrote a book called Urbanism in the Age of Climate Change, which is very much what the title implies, which is all the ways in which cities can both mitigate our impact on the globe, especially in terms of carbon emissions, but also how we can abate and accommodate the changes coming at us through better urban design. So that's a little bit of my background. Today, I wanted to talk about a book that came out since that time. It's really more of a report for um, the World Bank. having done work all over the world and in that particular moment working for the World Bank, I was asked to do a set of design principles. The problem, of course, with the World Bank is that they loan money in developing countries for major infrastructure, but they don't really look at how the infrastructure will impact the quality or the environmental impacts or the equity of the city that is resulting. Um, and so they actually wanted not only metrics, not only principles, but metrics, things that they could measure, that they could give to various recipient cities and say, you should be thinking about the following things. And so I'm going to start with these principles, and then I'm going to give you an overview of maybe how those principles play out. The underlying theme of the book and what I came to understand is that global sprawl is everywhere. Sprawl is everywhere. Sprawl being the condition of isolated land uses, very little concern for environmental impacts, loss of human scale, loss of diversity. Um, but they play out in different ways. And I concluded that really you could bundle them up into three categories. Low income sprawl, which is what happens in most of the world, the developing world, where low income populations move from rural environments to the city, but end up isolated on the edge in the most vulnerable pieces of land with the least number of services. The other one that's been happening, of course, was happening at a great pace was in China and Asia. I called it high density sprawl in the sense that it still led to loss of human scale and mixed use and walkability, but it was in a high rise context, which a lot of people think urbanism is related to density. Urbanism can happen at low density. It can, and it can, sprawl can happen at high density, and that's what we found in China. Finally, the one we all are familiar with, and I call it high income rather than low income sprawl, high income sprawl rather than low density sprawl, the American suburb, the Canadian suburb, the Australian suburb, the automobile-based suburb is what we most associate with the word. They all have common pathologies and they all have common solutions. And so this is just that three-part understanding of the metropolitan growth across the globe and how there are common solutions and common principles for all of them. And I've just gone through these three in advance of the slides. They look like completely different environments, and yet in terms of ecology, in terms of history, in terms of social fabric, they have many, many common features. So what are the unifying corrective principles? First is that growth needs to preserve natural ecologies, the agrarian landscapes that are important to a locale, establish neighborhoods and district, and of course, cultural heritage. And most growing cities don't even map, especially in the global south, don't even map these assets. We, of course, have finally come to a conclusion that historic preservation is important. We'll map that, and we now have sophisticated in the West mappings of environmental and ecological areas. So we're well aware of the kinds of territory that should not be disturbed when we grow, but we're not so good at preserving them. And so the postulate here is for the World Bank to ask about establishment of growth boundaries. Those are mechanisms that begin to draw lines around where you should and should not develop at a regional scale. And that is a profound step, and it's politically very difficult. And that there should be minimum densities of planning within those areas, so that we're not squandering land to consistently low density development. Redevelopment strategies are part of urban growth boundaries. If you're not going to expand outward, you need to find places within to intensify, to redevelop, to make better. And so actually mapping out where redevelopment should happen is a part of this regional planning exercise that I was advancing for the World Bank. And then, of course, preserving those critical ag lands, historic zones, ecological assets. it seems obvious, but it's not done. And it's not done because it's politically very difficult. In the global south, the poor will settle wherever the land is available. And typically it's available in inhospitable, low-lying areas, tragically so. Now, essential to all urbanism is mixed use, but also mixed income neighborhoods. Too much of sprawl isolates people by age group, by income group, by ethnicity. Enclaves and ghettos have always been a part of cities, and to a certain degree, you can say, well, then that's natural. I can say also that it's time we transcended that and we created neighborhoods that truly integrated, especially income categories, so inclusionary zoning for affordable, and of course, mixed-use zoning for local shops, local destinations are critical to creating walkable environments. Um, and so there are actual numbers here that 20% affordable, 0.15 FAR for non-residential areas in residential neighborhoods, clustering. All these things are things we can actually put numbers to by examining what best practices around the planet. Connectivity is a really big part of healthy cities, and we tend to design cities around super blocks, major arterial networks. In the United States, we have arterials typically in 1 mile center. Everything's isolated within cul-de-sacs, no continuity. So the return of the classic urban fabric of boulevards and avenues and local streets that connect through, but are human scale and walkable. You can actually summarize that by the scale of the block. So 1.5 hectare residential blocks and 3 hectare commercial blocks gets you to an urban fabric that is diverse and walkable, and also serves the needs of transit and cars. Decreased setbacks, of course, is just good urbanism to make streetscapes interesting places to walk. Gone are the day when a super block with towers in the park is a viable urban form. And yet in China, you see that as the norm. So we can say that perhaps we've gone beyond that in the West, but we haven't gone beyond that globally. Um, and so a minimum of 20% of land area for streets is an important designation for, once again, low-income developing cities where too often settlements happen without any right-of-way capacity. And of course, that leads to dysfunction and congestion. So it's interesting to be able to find real metrics you can put on this. Public space is key to great cities, great districts, great neighborhoods. And there are ratios, you know, walking distance to neighborhood parks and civic clusters, a minimum of 3 acre neighborhood and regional parks per population increment. Once again, there is global best practice, and it was nice that World Bank actually allowed us to publish what would be best practice. Walking and biking, there's no great city where you have no choice. And of course, it was tragic to watch China transition away from bicycles. Um, I'm now more interested in two-wheel vehicles because I think electric bikes are going to make a huge difference. But just diversifying the streetscape to allow for pedestrians, adequate space for pedestrians and bikes is a radical notion in many cities. And once again, we can put a number to it all. Making street crossings safe and convenient and small, and um, uh, and making the periphery of these blocks, the edge of the sidewalks, useful land use. Transit is also key to great cities. The idea that we can live in cities where everybody has a private automobile. I think we've seen the result of that. And the result in the United States, interestingly enough, even though many of the poor have cars, the economic burden of owning a car is now one of the greatest things pressing down on economic viability for what I call workforce in America today. If we can spend 30% of our income on housing, which is not viable for most now because housing has become so expensive. Moving ever outward to cheaper and cheaper subdivisions just adds an economic burden of more longer and longer commutes, which can be between 15 and 20% of household income for very low income populations. So the answer is local walkability, local destinations, but also transit that allows the city to be interconnected without freeways being solely dependent on freeways. And then, of course, this leads to our TOD sensibility in urban landscapes. Now, I'm going through a bit of a transition on TOD. A lot of people think of me as the father of TOD. I just renamed an old idea, which was streetcar suburbs in America. We used to have a beautiful system of really livable downtowns and then a series of small streetcar lines that led out to mixed use and walkable neighborhoods. And that's really the idea of the TOD. The problem is, at least in the United States, the cost of rail transit has become so exorbitant that we can't afford to build enough of it. And if we really want transit to function, for all and be a viable alternative to the car, it needs to be ubiquitous. And so I'm much more interested now in BRT, bus rapid transit, and then stringing a density along linear alignments as opposed to the more nodal quality of the traditional TOD. And so that I'll get into that as I move it. As a matter of fact, I'll get into it right now. Here we are in the United States, and of course, we are having a profound housing crisis. Uh, the working people who we don't, working poor, we pay less attention to. We were very focused on affordable housing, and rightly so, and then, of course, homelessness. But unless we solve for working households, affordable housing for working households that put them close to jobs and services, the market forces will continue to push the cost of all housing up, making it even more and more difficult to satisfy the affordable component. And so I think we need to start at the root, which is a supply and demand problem. We're not building enough housing. And some pretty profound changes have come into being since then. This is, I think, one of the more interesting graphs I've come across in a long time. And it shows you a picture, at least for California, but I think for all of the United States, of what has happened. We used to be a country where we built four single family homes for every one multifamily. We were the Ozzie and Harriet culture. People lived out on cul-de-sacs and they drove, and then they drove farther and farther and farther. Simultaneously, working people's and those houses, even though they were farther out, cost more and more because construction materials kept rising much faster than the average income of working people. And the breaking point came in 2008. Everybody thinks of that as primarily a kind of financial crisis. I think it was a crisis of, I got to shut my dogs up here in a minute. Sorry. It's a real crisis of housing production. In California, you can see here up to 2008, we were building 4 to 1, and we were building maybe 200,000 units a year. And that all stopped because in the end, people couldn't afford it. And the only way they could move the inventory, the inertia of the system and the zoning and the housing production and the financing, is all set up for single family subdivisions. So they kept producing it even though people couldn't afford it and really didn't need it and didn't want to travel that far. And what do you do when you have too much inventory? You put it on sale, you gimmick up the financing. And so I think the deeper root of what we should understand about 2008 is not subprime mortgages. That was just a mechanism to move inventory that no longer met the needs of working people in America. Of course, the wealthy can afford anything. They can go anywhere and do anything. But it's really the middle class and the lower middle class and the working people that were left out of the picture. So after the crash, what you see here in California is not only a huge deficit in housing production, but a 1-to-1 ratio, never seen before since World War II, multifamily to single family. As a matter of fact, you can see here that multifamily now We're producing more multifamily than we did prior to 2008. And the market is just basically saying that the subdivision is no longer a viable way to deliver housing at scale. And that's kind of good news. It's hard to make that adjustment. But the real question then becomes, well, if we're going to live denser lives, and we're going to want to do infill because we need to get people close to the existing jobs and services, where do you do it? This played out in California, where I was hired to kind of look at this at a macro scale. And the deficit, of course, kept growing. We would have more and more jobs, but not more and more housing. And only 50% of current population could afford, with 30% of their income, housing. Uh, we concede to this idea of grand boulevards, which is a pretty simple idea. Take all the underutilized strip commercial land along the kind of yesterday's version of the American dream, the arterial, and convert it to mixed income housing and mixed use development as of right. It doesn't really invade uh, stable neighborhoods and communities. It repairs the worst parts of those communities. And it turns out that there's just a vast reservoir of available land that's spread very appropriately throughout our communities and ripe for infill and that denser form of housing that may be a good fit. Um, I'm sorry. Somehow maybe I left out some slides here. Yeah, I did. There's a slide that's not here that's really important for the US, which is household type by demographic. And in the day that we were building single family, close to 50% of households were families with kids back in the 60s. Ozzy inherited. Now it's 19%. Um, Today, close to 35% of households are single people. So there's more than just economic reasons to think that more dense urban housing is appropriate. It is who we are as a culture and in our demographics. Single people really don't need a house on a cul-de-sac. Sorry, I left that out. Okay, so we can shape a law, and we did, that provides a range of housing along these arterials, has huge tax benefits, property tax benefits, because you're taking underutilized land and creating value there. Inclusionary, affordable housing and transit, bike, and street improvements, and no parking requirements. This is a kind of bold vision for what happens. And this is a picture of where you start. This is El Camino. We all know what it looks like. The road is too wide, has no human scale, and the development is sparse and of really little value. The idea is that you transition that 120-foot right of way into a living boulevard with housing over shops, with broad sidewalks and bike lanes and transit potential, BRT. Um, and the marketplace is saying yes to this kind of stuff. If you zone it, they will come because this is where the heart of the demand is. It's a big, long picture to get from that scrappy arterial to this, but at least we have a direction to move in that solves multiple problems simultaneously. So here's a piece of land. We're now doing a study from Washington State. This is an arterial there where we're looking at the same kind of infill that allows for this kind of zoning. Oh, excuse me. No, this is back in El Camino. I get my shows confused. Um, Examples of this are interesting. In Vancouver, they've had an urban growth boundary that's pretty much arrested all single family development, and they are going full on into TOD, and it's because they are able to build enough rail. Way out in the periphery on Langley City, we were given a dead mall site that we were able to, given their kind of zoning, build in really intensely. There's the old mall surrounded by parking. This is the new development with towers and parks, shopping, schools, and cultural facilities, all within walking distance of that transit station. So this kind of environment is being built, and it's at one end of the spectrum. I think in the U.S., the other end is the world of more three, 4 and 5 story apartment buildings over shops along a boulevard. But I have to applaud Canada for really going strong on this. Most of the people now buy homes in condominiums, hopefully in environments that have this kind of character where the pedestrian has free reign over many streets, and there's a lot of variety in the housing opportunities in parks. And of course, if you're familiar with the area, you can recognize the rail system stations and how the towers are all clustering there. Now, here's an example of high income sprawl. Like America, it turns out that Saudi Arabia is wealthy and it ends up with the same kind of trashy streets. This is Jeddah, the gateway to Mecca, a very important place on the planet in terms of its spiritual meaning to a vast number of people. But of course, there's a working middle class in Saudi Arabia that isn't wealthy and doesn't live in palaces, and they're underserved by their physical environment. And so recently we did a plan for about 20,000 acres of infill and redevelopment in the heart of Jeddah, wrapping around the historic center, a UNESCO site, La Balat. And here you can see in aerial all the sandy areas of redevelopment. So they went through and pretty much cleared out neighborhoods that were unsustainable in terms of infrastructure and quality of construction. Turned out to be a lot. Um, this uses a methodology that we have of using place types rather than land use zoning, and looking at urban fabric and building types, a whole layering of systems. And this is the master plan with transit and a whole range of development types. This is an important component of great urbanism, which is there's not one type of neighborhood, not one type of district. There's many of them, but they all should be mixed use. This we use the historic urban grid, the Hijazi pattern, narrower streets, streets with terminated vistas, less American, more of the character. Each neighborhood has a very important civic area, schools, mosques, parks, and shops that are within walking distance. And that, I think, is a structural element of all good urbanism. Um, and then the density areas here are identified by TODs again. Uh, and building types. Building types that are of the history of the place, of the character, and create human scale massing along the streets. High density sprawl is the interesting category. As I mentioned, this is Beijing, and you know, if any of you have had a chance to visit, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's all super blocks and it's all smog. And it's all built on the old Corbusian modernist notion of urbanism, which loves the car and loves the high rise, but the high rise as an isolated object, not as an integrated object. And of course, these places are quite monotonous. One size fits all is never a formula for healthy urbanism. This is an abstract model of a housing district in Kunming, where actually these arterials are a quarter mile intersection to intersection, and everything within those intersections are super blocks with very little local destinations and pedestrian scale. We demonstrated and we tried to advocate that this picture contains exactly the same amount of development as the previous picture, and the same amount of asphalt, in fact, but allows for a true urban environment to evolve. So for the same investment and for the same amount of construction, you can end up in these two different categories. So it turns out urban design has a huge, powerful impact. We were able to take our design principles, which were the foreshadowing what we did for the World Bank, and propose it before President Xi took power um, to the Central National Council, and they adopted these principles: growth boundaries and walkable neighborhoods, narrow streets, and biking, transit. All these things now became actually national urban design policy. Um, this is an example of a district just north of Chongqing. Chongqing is a, a mega region of 30 million people. Off to the right, you can see the airport for scale. The study area is planned for 4 million people, and they said, how would you use your principles to develop that kind of domain? And of course, it starts with preserving the ecological assets. You can see the ridge lines and high topo areas and also the drainage ways. But then it has a pretty intense overlay of transit. Each one of those circles is a walking radius. So even though you're building for 4 million people, the vast majority of them can actually walk to transit and therefore to services. And this is an example of one of those TODs that we tried to show, breaking down the city block into courtyard configurations, variety in the building type, and of course, more density at the transit center. The transit center here is actually below grade, below a park that becomes the focal point for the whole community. And the normative city block, just 100 meters is, between intersections, that's a human scale walk. And you get a really what is kind of a tradition of urbanism around the world. The public street and the semi-private shared courtyard surrounded by different building types. The whole waterfront is preserved in this plan. And when you look at this comparison of, it's a lot of topography, but the scale of the city blocks and the mix of uses becomes clear in a whole different kinds of pattern. The brown area and the other one was all the commercial land, totally isolated from the residential land. The residential land just having a few arterials moving through it. And then this plan shows you how the open space is configured, not just as ecological spaces along the river and in some of the steeper areas, but also you'll see all these green passageways. Those are auto-free streets. At that time, I was working in China. Um, only 30% of households have cars. So the idea that 100% of streets should be for cars just didn't make sense, even though they had been building as if cars were the only way you could move around. And so that green setback along the water was not historically the norm there. And then this is a picture in a different project because it's flat of a auto-free street, transit at its center, walking and biking at its edges, and density wrapping around it. This is a version of the Grand Boulevard idea that we're trying to move towards for the stipulation. I failed to mention when I was covering Grand Boulevards, I should have gone a little more deeply into that because this is largely a Western audience. We have now passed a law in California called AB 2011, which, as of right, no local NIMBYs can stop it, converts strip commercial land um, into mixed use, mixed income. It requires 15% inclusionary. It eliminates all parking standards so that we don't overbuild and overcharge for parking. And it easily produces, at least in the Bay Area, about 1.3 million units of housing. As a matter of fact, there's a road that runs through the heart of Silicon Valley, El Camino, from San Francisco down to San Jose, but one of the most job-rich areas in the country. The strip commercial on that land alone would accommodate 250,000 units of infill workforce housing and affordable housing. on a ribbon that could easily be converted to transit. Finally, I wanted to cover this other one, which is, so much of the global urban environment is happening in the global south. And of course, it's even more challenging than you would think. We did a project for the World Bank in Ho Chi Minh City, sustainable and resilient. This was, unfortunately, truncated by COVID, and we didn't really get to finish it. But I think we got to some very interesting conclusions. Obviously, these are becoming mega cities, and this just shows the growth of Ho Chi Minh City. And then this shows the urban fabric of it. It's a city that's already underwater in great proportion. Um, Such resilient, energetic, and actually fun people. They just kind of bear through it all. But this just shows the ill-conceived, ad hoc matter. 90% of all trips in Ho Chi Minh City are on motorcycles. And it turns out motorcycles are a very efficient form of transit, particularly if you convert them to electric. This is a mapping of Ho Chi Minh City, and the light brown is the sections of the city that is normative for inundation. And then you can see to the south of the kind of airport in the center there, um, a vast amount of land that's being built in the wetlands. They seem to have accommodated themselves to it. And I think as we see the impacts of climate change rise higher and higher, this is a more and more foolish pattern of growth. So we started at the macro scale saying, well, exactly where should this city be? And it turns out there's lots of high ground nearby, just to the north, west, that could accommodate all the growth of the city. They just need to point all the infrastructure in that direction. Lots of analysis of just how bad the climate change impact is going to be on this city because of flooding. And then, of course, that has a huge impact on the economy of the city, which then trickles down to the cost of living for everybody in the city. Um, it's it looks tough to solve places like this. I think that rather than thinking about migration away from cities and away from certain countries, I think shifts within the city terrain are going to be more viable. So solving for affordable housing and putting it in the right place makes all the sense in the world. Along comes the Western engineers, and their solution is ring dikes. Having worked on the recovery for southern Louisiana after Katrina, I know that these kinds of things don't work, and they particularly don't work in environments where they can't really afford to complete them. A ring dike is only as good as the last opening. And also, of course, all the pump stations fail over time. So this just shows highlighted in yellow the high ground areas that are just safe naturally for people to live in. And you can see that they're not far from the historic center, and they're not moving down into the wetlands and the delta area. The Western engineers also showed up and said, look, here are 8 metro lines. And I'm supposed to be an advocate for transit. But in the end, I said, no, the best solution there is to dedicate certain streets and even elevated lanes for motorcycles. The problem of mobility here is mixing the different modes. If you actually analyze the throughput on a lane, you get more than light rail by just letting people sit on their motorcycles. And quite frankly, they have built BRT in Vietnam. Nobody wants to get on a hot, crowded bus and stop, every eighth of a mile. They'd rather be on their bike and be able to roam around the city and stop and see their friends when they see one on the sidewalk. So it's a matter of reorganizing the space. So we did the analysis, and people were really surprised by this, but 31,000 trips per hour in a motorcycle lane versus all the other modes of transit. You have to get up to pretty heavy metro to beat that. Um, the other thing, of course, we had to say no more development in the sensitive ecological wetlands, the mangrove forest. And that goes back to one of the first principles that you saw in this presentation, which is we need to draw lines around preservation areas and make sure that they are kept natural and clear. For the high ground development areas, you need a whole network of drainage ways, which can also become beautiful linear parks. So there's always a win-win to accommodating nature and bringing it into your communities. And so these are some of the ideas. It's a wonderful city, wonderful people. This is their traditional housing pattern. It's shop house, where the ground floor is business, and then the upper stories are multi-generational housing. You couldn't ask for a better urban piece of DNA. Heat island effect is going to be profound, and of course, it keeps growing and growing. And the simple solution, we can talk about all sorts of technology, but it's trees. It's trees. It is trees. Tree-lined streets, tree shaded parks. It's a simple technology. It's beautiful technology, and it's what cities need if you're going to begin to mitigate heat island effects. So that's just a quick overview of where we came to. I'm sorry I didn't drill down a little more into what I'm most interested in now is this Grand Boulevard idea. We are, as I said, it's an adopted policy in California. Um, it's important because it can solve the housing crisis at scale. There's a little talk now of this, why don't we just convert single family lots. But the problem with that is mom and pop really aren't going to become developers at scale and live with construction sites and contractors and permits and bank financing and all the things it takes. And converting the strip is taking what is the worst of our land and turning it into something not only useful, but perhaps something that reconnects our communities at the metropolitan scale. So I'll stop there.
Here, always the last question is, you have people here from all over the world, from multiple areas. They want to be able to be passionate advocates on creating more equitable and sustainable. What is your call to action to the people that are on the line? What should they do? This is not an academic exercise. People connected is because they want to do something. So what is your call to action if we want to have cities more aligned with what you just presented? And also that you just show that it's doable. It's not something impossible. So what is your call to action? And that's the last question.
Well, I think that a lot of people are more focused on local government governance than they are on regional or state. And I think the solutions here, whether it's an urban growth boundary or investment in major investments in new transit lines that cross multiple jurisdictional boundaries, or housing policy that can't be endlessly litigated in ways that obviously frustrate construction. I think people should take the time to find their way into the politics of their state and their regional governments and become advocates there. Local city councils and planning departments don't seem capable of rising above local prejudice. And I think if you look to elect smart people at the state government level, the provincial level, in the case of Canada, um, and begin to point the direction that they have the right and the legal capacity to zone for housing in the best locations. And it's going to be their responsibility because I'm no longer convinced local government will make it happen. So focus on state and regional governments and see what you can do politically. That would
Peter,
be my
thank you
advice.
very, very much. And everyone, you can Google and go to the Ending Global Sprawl. You can get a book through the World Bank. You can get a link to
Thank you very much, everybody.
Peter. Thank you. Thank you. What a fascinating presentation. You gave us so many examples of low income sprawl, high income sprawl, high density sprawl, and also in many places around the world. You showed some from emerging countries, some from China, some from the US, from Canada, for multiple places, and you provided solutions. How to get this done? And I think it's going to be very important. I hope that everyone who watches this video will share it with decision makers, elected officials, city staff, state or provincial staff, federal staff, from public health, from transportation, from planning, from environment, from all areas, because this crosses everyone. And also with the media and with advocacy groups. Peter, thank you very much. You have left lots and lots of knowledge for everyone. And I think that now the task of everyone who watches this is to absorb the information and do something positive with it. Thanks, everybody. We had hundreds and hundreds of people from all over the world. We had people from 33 countries. And I'm really grateful that every other week, most of you connect live to see the sessions. Have a wonderful day.